let's finish this up. Okay, section 4. What should Christians do? And we're talking about government and politics. Yay, always fun, you know. It's one thing to know that God cares about politics and that we should care too, since we're made in his image. It's another thing entirely to know what Christian involvement ought to look like. Some think Christians ought to take over government to make everyone comply with God's law. Within this view, some advocate confiscating wealth because God cares about the poor. Others suggest slashing government size because God cares about freedom and stewardship. Sandwiched between self-righteousness and political opportunism are thick layers of questionable Bible interpretation. Political parties love this. Take a few Bible verses out of context, and voila, voters flock to your righteous candidate or viewpoint. Christians should be wise and morally centered rather than gullible, but power is alluring. How can we avoid being seduced by it? First, we must be clear about what forms us, our culture, or our community, and courageously stand for truth. Second, we must identify the proper boundaries of society's spheres and protect the proper domain of each. Third, we must be good citizens. And fourth, in all things, we must be prepared to obey God rather than people. Let's examine each in turn. Be clear about what forms us. The principle of subsidiarity. I learned how to say that word. What shapes us more, the culture or the communities? It's an important question. People in our own communities know more about the problems we face than people working in offices in far-off capital cities. Many fail to consider that our greatest influence might not be in grabbing the reins of power at the highest level, but in mobilizing people to seek solutions at the lowest levels. This is called subsidiarity, and it goes back to medieval theologian and philosopher Thomas Aquinas. Subsidiarity claims that it's wrong for a larger or higher association to step in and try to fix a problem when an institution closer to the issue can act. So, for example, when a young family finds itself in trouble, it's inappropriate, even unjust, for the state or federal government to provide aid when extended family members, a local church, or neighbors can help the family in need. Economist Samuel Gregg thinks subsidiarity is consistent with biblical thought and suggests 5 biblical values to apply in our world today. Wealth creation over wealth redistribution. History shows that people benefit when they can work to improve their lots themselves. We're made to be producers, not merely consumers. It's not okay to force other people to hand over what they've worked to earn, and it doesn't suddenly become right if we can persuade the government to do it for us. 2. Accountability and transparency, truth over falsehood. In a true market economy, people are held accountable for poor economic decisions by the outcomes of those decisions. A culture of bailouts and corporate welfare undermines this value. It's not fair to ask government to force taxpayers to make sacrifices for the risky decisions of the elites. Justice, the rule of law over the rule of people. None of these values will amount to much if the government fails to enforce just laws. In addition to protecting the innocent and punishing wrongdoers, securing justice provides a climate of stability in which wealth creators can reap the rewards of their risk and create greater abundance. 4. Property rights over dirigism. Dirigism, pronounced dirigism, there it is simply the government stepping into the private sector to directly manage wealth. Leaders who regularly threaten to diminish private property rights create uncertainty, diminish investment, and generate a climate of fear. 5. Hope over fear, openness versus defensiveness. We shouldn't be fearful of a market economy. We shouldn't have a bias against business. Productive people aren't the bad guys, and our society ought to stop portraying them as such. These points make subsidiarity practical. They break the spell of power and emphasize servanthood instead. They direct our thinking to living wisely in community. We must abide by a clear understanding of justice, accountability, and rights, lest we become corrupted by seeking the power we think we need to do good. Power is enticing. The more we have, the more successful we think we are. Power makes us feel important. It offers the illusion of earthly security. As the Colson Center's John Stonestreet warns, it is nearly impossible not to confuse power with success. Complicating the problem is the practice of political parties viewing Christians as an interest group whose loyalty may be bought. People who advocate government intervention, for instance, appeal to Christians' concern for the downtrodden to justify power-expanding government programs. People who worship money, on the other hand, may appeal to Christians' appreciation of hard work to justify policies that help large corporations secure an unfair advantage. Charles Colson is an example of a believer who transcended political partisanship. First known as a Republican firebrand who proudly proclaimed his ruthlessness in achieving the Nixon administration's goals, Colson later served a term in prison and became a born-again Christian. Based on his prison experience, Colson emerged as what journalist David Plotz called the nation's greatest prison reformer, who started Bible studies to transform prisoners. New York Times columnist Ross Douthat says Colson's prison work served as a kind of countersign, a public reminder that his belief in the gospel of Jesus Christ shaped his public commitments, rather than the other way around. Another example of a believer who seems to be transcending political partisanship is Princeton professor Robert George. George is a committed conservative. An article in the Catholic magazine Crisis a few years ago stated that if there really is a vast right-wing conspiracy, its leaders probably meet in George's kitchen. But George's scholarly work has earned such respect that he now occupies a prestigious academic position Woodrow Wilson once held. And yet George doesn't hesitate to admonish leaders to stand for what is right. For example, he urged Republican President George W. Bush to restrict embryonic stem cell research and challenged Democratic President Barack Obama to actively protect religious freedom. Christians may be partial to one political party or another for various reasons. This is fine in and of itself, but if Christians find themselves overly fascinated by power, it's time to go back to the basics and seek to be informed by what God says rather than what the popular culture says. Help protect the spheres. As God's image bearers, we're caretakers of our families, the church, and the government. But how do we manage the boundaries between these three spheres? In the late 1800s and early 1900s, Dutch theologian and statesman Abraham Kuyper, who for a time was Prime Minister of the Netherlands, called for a view of sphere sovereignty, in which each sphere has a proper domain, balancing each other and managing its own areas of responsibility. When one sphere abandons its responsibility or steps into another sphere, it can cause oppression and misery. Imagine 3 balloons in a box, just big enough to fit them all. If one balloon is blown up bigger, the other 2 get squeezed. Sphere sovereignty says the balance between the institutions in society is like that. If the church sphere gets too big, as often happens in the Middle Ages, families and the government will get squeezed. If the family sphere gets too big, as happened in Italy in the 1400s, when a handful of powerful families, such as the Medici family, controlled everything, the church and the government will find it difficult to operate properly. Today, the rapid expansion of government can hurt families and churches, but what is the proper boundary of each sphere? Let's have a look. Family. The family sphere is responsible for forming stable marriages and providing for and educating children. Other worldviews focus on logic, economic structures, spoken language, higher consciousness, or Sharia law, but Christianity says the family is the glue of society. A society can survive the miseries of corruption, violence, and crime, but if the family falls apart, societal collapse is inevitable. From a Christian worldview, God ordained the family. It was the first social institution. Man-woman marriage is at its core. Scripture teaches in Ephesians 5 that husbands should love their wives just as Christ loved the church. This radically departs from the ways of ancient Greece and Rome, in which sexual perversion, especially homosexual pedophilia, was common. Christianity taught that sexuality was meant to be experienced only within marriage, to bond a man and woman together and to produce children. Only in Christianity, said Will Durant, did sexual fidelity become a virtue. But families today are unraveling at an alarming rate. Fatherlessness has reached epidemic proportions. Young men and women between the ages of 17 and 24 are far more likely to abuse drugs or commit crimes if they come from fatherless homes. legalized abortion has led to a devaluing of children, and child abuse rates have risen in tandem with abortion rates. Being raised by parents who have been involved in same-sex relationships is correlated with several negative social outcomes, including crime, substance abuse, and forced sexual encounters. According to the biblical view, the correction for these ills is a disciplined commitment to marriage between one man and one woman for life. This, not bigotry, explains why Christians call for a return to traditional marriage and traditional values such as love, fidelity, and respect. The church. The church sphere is responsible for interpreting God's word and discipling people to obey it in every area in which Jesus Christ has authority, which is every area of life. The Greek word for church used in the New Testament is ecclesia, a community united by God's Spirit and charged with proclaiming the reality of Christ's kingdom to the whole world. The church was a new, unfamiliar idea in New Testament times, and scripture writers employed many metaphors to describe it, such as bride, army, nation, body, family, team, temple, flock, feast, and hospital. The church is the very model of what the good life is about. Churches are to proclaim the truth regarding sin, repentance, and salvation, but the church sphere involves much more. Churches invite individuals into communities to work together to nurture one another and serve the larger society. The church can model true community by demonstrating what it means to love your neighbor as yourself. Theologian and social thinker Francis Schaeffer thought the twin roles of proclaiming truth and fostering community were the basis of the church's credibility. I am convinced that in the 20th century, people all over the world will not listen if we have the right doctrine, the right polity, but are not exhibiting community. The church isn't merely a place to listen to sermons, it's where God's people gather to learn how to minister to the world. As Pastor Tony Evans puts it, to be a part of the Church of Jesus Christ, as Jesus defined it, is to be a part of a spiritual legislative body tasked to enact heaven's viewpoint in hell's society. Government. The government sphere has two God-ordained tasks: protect the innocent and punish the guilty. By administering justice and defending against attack, government plays a key role in society. In an age of ever-expanding government, it is up to the family sphere and the church sphere to keep watch on government so it doesn't overstep its bounds or fail to fulfill its responsibilities. In most nations with a functioning government, a written constitution restricts government's activity. As society becomes more secularized, though, the demand for larger government pushes against these boundaries. When we say things like government ought to take care of this or there ought to be a law about this, we risk idolizing government. Recognizing the sovereignty of each sphere helps us avoid this. It helps keep government from becoming alluring as a means by which to gain power and prestige, and puts power in the hands of people who truly want to serve rather than be served. Still, in spite of the best efforts of good people, government often fails. But this shouldn't cause us to be pessimistic. Government helps secure freedom and enable responsibility, which enables us to better bear God's image with dignity and significance. This, in turn, empowers us to get involved and make sure government does its job in protecting the innocent and maintaining justice. Because of the human sin nature, though, it's wise to keep government's powers in perspective. Government isn't God. It secures rights, but doesn't invent them. It acknowledges human value, but doesn't grant it. Government may not be the source of most of our problems, but it often makes them worse when it tries to solve them, as we'll see in the chapter on poverty. Here's an example of how a proper balance between the spheres can help everyone live better lives. Imagine a city finding it has a high number of children whose parents have abandoned them. Would it be wise for government to take matters into its own hands and house the children in city-run orphanages, compelling taxpayers to fund the effort? Well, the government is supposed to protect the innocent, but taking on the responsibility that families are to bear, and that the church can greatly help with risks harming children rather than helping them. Also, the government isn't equipped, like the family or the church, to offer the kind of precise solutions required when dealing with individual lives. If, on the other hand, the city government asks churches for help, churches can recruit and support families willing to take in foster children. The government can exercise its proper role as a clearinghouse for identifying children in need of help. Families, in turn, can give unwanted children a loving environment in which to grow and flourish. When forced with a decision about which sphere ought to act and in what ways, we need to grapple with 3 questions. Is this the proper domain of this sphere? What is the effect on the other spheres? How can this problem be solved in a way that strengthens each sphere? God cares about the spheres of family, church, and state. Indeed, he cares about everything. As Abraham Kuyper expressed it, there is not 1 square inch of the entire creation about which Jesus Christ does not cry out, "This is mine. This belongs to me." Ensuring a proper balance between the spheres isn't just something family, church, and government leaders are to do. It's our individual responsibility as well. Both individuals and societal groups are accountable to God. The role of people in ensuring the proper functioning of society is called citizenship. What it involves is what we'll explore next. In an earlier chapter, I quoted theologian A.W. Tozer, who noted that what you think about when you think about God is the most important thing about you. It's true for nations as well as people. He says, "The history of mankind will probably show that no people has ever risen above its religion, and man's spiritual history will positively demonstrate that no religion has ever been greater than its idea of God. If people have a big view of God, society thrives. If they have a small view of God, society withers. This doesn't mean Christians should step in and take over government. Rather, it means we should be good citizens in balancing family, church, and state. We can do this by being interested, being involved, and being informed. As servant leaders, Christians are to take others into account and think about others' needs, not just their own. At a basic level, this means taking care that the pursuit of our interests doesn't injure other people. Take, for example, the Mosaic command in Exodus. When a man opens a pit or when a man digs a pit and does not cover it, and an ox or a donkey falls into it, the owner of the pit shall make restoration. He shall give money to its owner, and the dead beast shall be his. Such laws about neighborliness evolved into what we called tort law. We're obligated to act in a way that won't harm our neighbor's interests. Just as we must avoid negligently harming others, we must also take an interest in helping others flourish. Are our communities flourishing because we're there? Are we and those around us reflecting the image of God? Are the people in our realm of influence becoming more mature? Expressing interest also means voting. For many years, I taught political communication at a Christian college in which students complained incessantly about their elected officials. Yet the day after the election, I discovered that only 2 of my students had voted. Most weren't even registered to vote. I told them, for the rest of the semester, if you didn't vote, you've lost your right to complain. For probably a decade after that, one student called me every election season to let me know she voted. Let's face it, voting is the most basic act a citizen can take. In a government where the authority rests with the people, failing to vote is disobeying the biblical command to submit to the governing authorities. Get to know your elected officials and their office staff personally. Find ways to help them in areas of agreement. Not only will this promote the common good, but it will give you credibility in persuading them in areas where you disagree. Political figures are real people struggling with real issues. The people who work in their offices aren't just faceless, nameless bureaucrats. They are real people who have families, hopes, dreams, and frustrations. Get to know them. Express concern for them. Be the kind of person they want to take seriously when they get a telephone call from you about a pressing issue. Being involved in politics at a grassroots level is easier than it sounds. Every elected official has a website with an email address and telephone number. Just Google it. Find out when they're having an open meeting and go. Make it a point to introduce yourself to the elected official and his or her staff members and key supporters. Perhaps volunteer for that person's campaign or offer to help in the office. Study the job responsibilities this official has been given by law. They'll be posted on their website and perhaps on city, county, state, and federal government websites as well. Making a difference doesn't begin with a dreamy, feel-good state. It begins with showing up. It ends with showing up. Those who show up will make a difference. Those who don't, won't. At Summit Ministries, one of our themes is, if you ever want to be a leader, you've got to be a reader. You can't truly understand political issues merely by reading internet snippets and watching obnoxious soundbite debates. If you want to do everything you can to exercise your rights and privileges as a citizen, you've got to develop a clear and purposeful reading strategy. Read Christian publications like World Magazine, a local newspaper, and at least one substantial book a month. But don't just passively absorb information. Read legislative bills. Follow the blogs of people who are putting in the time to study issues. Examine founding documents such as the Federalist Papers and Anti-Federalist Papers, as well as classic political texts by authors like John Locke and Samuel Rutherford, also known as Rutherford. When political candidates speak, show up. In my personal experience, this takes no more than 4 or 5 hours a month. Could you devote an hour a week to making your community, state, and nation a better place? If you don't act to secure God-given rights, why would anyone else take you seriously when those rights are in jeopardy? Obey God rather than people. We open this chapter with an example from Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who, out of concern over Hitler's evil activities, chose the course of civil disobedience. It seems like a fairly straightforward choice given the difficulties of the times, but controversy rages about it to this day. Are Christians ever justified in breaking laws they're convinced are unjust? If we can't discern God's law, it's almost impossible to object when human laws contradict it. In his letter from the Birmingham jail, Martin Luther King Jr. wrote, "I would agree with St. Augustine that an unjust law is no law at all. Now, what is the difference between the two? How does one determine whether a law is just or unjust? A just law is a man-made code that squares with the moral law of the law of God. An unjust law is a code that is out of harmony with the moral law. If it's true that all just human laws are based on God's law, then when human laws come into conflict with the God's laws, we must choose to obey God. We must say, as Peter and the other apostles did in Acts 5, we must obey God rather than men. Often the issue is more complex than a simple choice between obeying God's law and obeying human law. Sometimes it involves ignoring human laws that don't please God. This was the conclusion Andrew Vanderbijl reached. Vanderbijl became famous as Brother Andrew for smuggling Bibles into communist countries against the will of those countries' leaders. His moment of decision came as he watched a socialist parade in one of the countries he was hoping to influence. This is what he said. "Not for a moment did I believe the young socialists were there under coercion. They marched because they believed. They marched 8 abreast, healthy, vital, clean-cut. They marched singing, and their voices were like shouts. On and on they came for 10 minutes, 15 minutes, rank after rank of young men and young women. The effect was overwhelming. These were the evangelists of the 20th century. These were the people who went about shouting their good news, and part of the news was that the old shackles and superstitions of religion, the old inhibiting ideas about God, no longer held. Man was his own master. The future was his to take." What should be done? Wondered Vanderbijl. Should anti-God forces be allowed to win by default? In his personal Bible study, he came across this passage from Revelation 3. "Awake and strengthen what remains and is on the point of death." Vanderbijl realized he was responsible not for overthrowing governments, but for strengthening the hand of those who were committed to obeying God first and foremost. Thus began a smuggling operation that brought Bibles into countries that were openly promoting atheism and trying to destroy Christianity's influence. But how is Bible smuggling any different from evading arrest or refusing to pay taxes? It certainly appears rebellious. Aren't Christians supposed to be subject to the governing authorities and live at peace with everyone? Vanderbijl said those who oppose God's law are enemies. We're to love them, but we're not to let them win. We're not to be conquered by evil. Vanderbilt used the following example. Imagine you're a soldier reporting to your commanding officer that you can't capture the positions you've been ordered to take because the enemy won't let you. This is unacceptable. It is your duty to capture the position in spite of opposition. Yet, said Vanderbilt, a lot of Christian soldiers seem to be saying to their commander, we can't advance because the enemy disapproves of our objectives and is not willing to let us succeed. In future chapters, we'll look at difficult questions regarding justice, the use of force, and defending religious freedom, and try to gain insight into how to wisely obey God, even when it means disobeying people. This isn't a light decision. We need the counsel of wise people in the church, the ecclesia. We need to be certain there is no recourse available through existing laws, but in the end we may have to choose between obeying God and obeying people, and we must be prepared to make that choice regardless of the possibility of punishment. As God's image bearers, we each take responsibility before God to discern His will through natural law and revelation, and then take action to ensure that government does its job to protect the innocent and establish justice. This is what politics is all about. The family, in educating and nurturing the rising generation, is involved in politics. The church, in discipling all people to obey God, is involved in politics too. The alternative to being interested, involved, and informed is unthinkable. President Abraham Lincoln once mused about how we are our own worst enemy. At what point, then, is the approach of danger to be expected? I answer, if it ever reach us, it must spring up amongst us. It cannot come from abroad. If destruction be our lot, we must ourselves be its author and finisher. As a nation of freemen, we must live through all time or die by suicide. We are image bearers of God. We are citizens. Politics is our opportunity and also our responsibility. The end.